Hello, and welcome to the first curve that we're going to be talking about in this series, the surprise. This curve is really good at creating mindfulness in your players and generating anxiety and worry, and that is a really fun emotion to play with in Dungeons & Dragons. This curve starts at the second highest point of intensity. The reason it doesn't start at the highest is because you really want that peak to hit right after so that the players feel like there's a way to go. If they don't have that sense of we're going from the surprise to something even more intense, then you don't really create the feeling of intensity moving forward throughout the fight, and they won't carry that with them moving forward after the fight. To create a strong experience, basically what you need is dynamics, and dynamics are basically what's the difference in intensity from point A to point B in a curve. Now, the tension in this fight starts fairly high, and that's because the players are caught by surprise. So because players are caught unaware and out of position, then what happens is they're totally unprepared for a fight. That's usually the important part. So you want the context to sort of work with that. And the unpreparedness on the part of the players makes that tension pretty scary. And some of them are going to have to like draw new weapons and get ready to go. Maybe somebody doesn't have a mage armor cast, stuff like that. And that can cause a lot of worry. So you get a pretty good initial spike, and that's really useful. But then it tapers off. And remember, you want to truncate this fight, so you want to end it as quickly as you can. The length of the fight is the exact amount of length that you need to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish with this combat curve. And even if you're doing the longer version of this curve, you still want to truncate. You don't really want the fight to resolve ever. By giving the fight a strong resolution, you really create a strong starting and ending point between where the fight ends and then whatever happens after the fight starts. And that means that those two things are very compartmentalized, which makes it very difficult for you to carry emotional context from the encounter into whatever you're doing next. That's why it's so important in the surprise to truncate that curve. You don't want to resolve the fight. Don't let your players actually successfully kill the thing. Have it leave. Have it crumble to dust. You know, if you have like this weird undead thing that crumbles to dust but then reforms itself, maybe it even formed itself out of dust, and then when it crumbles to dust, players are like, I don't know if that's even really dead. Great. You don't want them to feel like they succeeded and completed their task. You want them to feel like something is unfinished. And of course, if it's shorter, it's just a trap. And sometimes that's all you need. Traps are great at making players generally more aware of their environment, and they'll do things like check for traps relatively frequently. And then you have this idea of checking for traps, and you can build a more specific gameplay loop into that. That's not what this video is about, but traps are certainly very useful. And you can think of traps as basically a sub 1 round surprise curve. Turning it into an actual combat encounter is a little bit different. It accomplishes a little bit more than a trap could, or even multiple traps, because while traps will make your players more aware of your environment, a curve makes your players afraid of your environment. Because what happens is, by using these curves, you can start playing with the player experience. And one thing that you can do that horror games, really good ones, do a lot is put your players in a situation where things are pretty tense, but then allow that tension to resolve a little bit. Not really resolve, but drop. And then as they move forward, you let them move forward and you don't really mess with them, and you let them start to feel complacent. And that's when you get them. Because by creating a strong association between that degree of tension and fear and their sense of complacency, what you create is an inability for the player to ever really feel safe. And while a horror game utilizes a tension release cycle really well, and you do want to release the tension sometimes, you still always want that underlying worry. Because without that underlying worry, players start to get to the point where they feel totally safe, things resolve really nicely, and it's not as effective. Item number 1, truncate that curve. Item number 2, make that combat as short as you can while still accomplishing everything you need to accomplish. A combat going longer than it needs to can really undermine tension. Because players make decisions based on emotional context and the memory of the experience, even if it's only a 30-second old memory, it's still a memory, which means they're thinking about the experience holistically. And if you take that and you combine it with the idea of worry superseding complacency, then you end up with this excellent foundation for horror, because now the players are worried, they're not going to get complacent, and also you've showed them that things are going to get tough and sometimes out of nowhere. So players start to get very concerned with their surroundings, and it feels very overwhelming to them, and that's a good thing in this case if you're trying to create horror, especially because if a player is worried about all of these different things, maybe a player can be worried about 3 or 4 things at a time, but if they feel like there's at least 2 or 3 other things that they should be worried about that they can't be worried about, that's great, because now they're never going to feel totally safe. And if you're trying to create a horror segment, that is invaluable. That's your foundation. So just to really hammer this point home, if you did all that, but then you resolved the tension in the fight that precedes the segment that you want to be a horror segment, because that would separate the fight from the segment so dramatically, you would undercut a lot of those things that you've taught your players, like be worried about being complacent. Those kinds of associations would be largely, if not entirely, undercut. So how can you make this curve actually work? Well, my first example is a really simple one. It's the assassin creature. It's a CR8 creature, so it'll generally be fighting players of about that level. And against players of, let's say, 7th to 9th level, it has not very high AC and not very high hit points, which means it can pop out, do some damage, take some damage, and then leave. It also has high dex, which means it'll have high initiative. Going early in the turn order can help a lot here because you really want those spikes to happen as early as possible. Also, because it's so agile and effective at hiding, the assassin can come in, get a couple big hits off, and leave. And because of its assassinate trait and the sneak attack trait, it can come in and do a lot of damage and then just leave. And because that fight is unresolved, players are going to continue to be worried. Now, you might think, well, obviously, if the creature is still alive, players are still going to be worried about it because it's still probably out there somewhere. Well, why is that? Because it's unresolved. So if you resolve it, you can't have worry. So you might be thinking, well, that seems obvious. And yes, and it illustrates why you don't want to resolve the combat. The next example is the graveyard. Imagine your players are walking through the graveyard with cold, still air sticking their faces as they move forward. A shadow flies overhead. You can't make out its source, but whatever it is, it's big. It flies past you and continues on its way. You walk a little longer, surrounded by the eerie silence of the graveyard. Suddenly, something cold grabs at your leg. Make grapple checks. Roll initiative. Intensity is super high. It just starts and it's super high as zombie hands burst from the ground and zombies begin to crawl from their graves all around you. And this is the combat that we're going to use as an example for the curve. So intensity starts really high and the hands popping out of the graves, very iconic. Pretty much everyone's gonna know exactly what's going on. That's great. And then we just need to ramp into something. Of course, if the players all do pretty well on their grapple checks, maybe they just leave. Maybe they just leave, and that's potentially fine, because now it functions basically like a trap. And if that's all you need for this environment to happen, no problem. You can even have the zombies start to slowly crawl out of their graves, but because it takes so long for them to do that, the players can just kind of leave, and there you go. They just encountered a trap and then left. It's not really resolved because the zombies are still around, but they can just leave, and the zombies chasing them is not really an issue because you're establishing that the zombies are slow. If you want something a little bit longer, that's fine too. In fact, this same example continues to work. Just make it so that the zombies crawl out of the graves a little bit faster, so that as the players are getting out of those grapples, zombies are coming out and they're starting to get surrounded. And now they have to fight their way through a couple of them, and maybe they just have to kill a couple to make room and then go. But that additional intensity, because the zombies are still coming out and that intensity starts to rise a little bit and we hit that peak, then it starts to drop because they kill a couple and start to leave. But the fight is still really truncated because all the zombies are still there as they run away. Now, if the players don't run away, that's a different issue. You might even transition into a 5-round version of this curve. In that longer version, zombies do start to come out of the graves pretty quickly, but they're very weak and they start getting taken out. So as the zombies come in, there's a spike of an intensity, but the players start to realize, no, we can handle these zombies. We're killing them really quickly and easily. But as they're fighting, they start to realize that zombies are continuing to come out of graves, even from far around them, and starting to come in. And now they have to come up with some way out. They might not be able to even fight their way out, and that's another nice little spike. Now, you do need to make sure that there's some way out of the situation for them. It can't just be, well, I guess there's too many zombies for you to deal with, because if your players all die, tension goes right out the window. So that's always important to consider. But we did have that creature that flew overhead, so maybe that can come back and help. Or maybe they get out of the zombie encounter and then they encounter the creature, and the creature, they don't know what it is, but they know that the graveyard has been trying to kill them and it's scary and they're worried about it. And now there's this creature that they're encountering, and I guarantee you they will be quite afraid of that thing. So, quick overview. Just remember, when you're designing for this curve, to figure out exactly how long you need it to be, 2 rounds, about 2 rounds, is a good, very short version of this combat that helps to create some degree of tension in the following area, in the space that you're trying to create for them afterwards. A 5-round version of this combat, or whatever, roughly 5, means that you're going to be really crafting like a horror foundation. That way, everything that they're doing moving forward is going to be really scary because you've established that tension, and that second spike has successfully punished them for feeling complacent. Or you can just do traps. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how traps work, but by putting them in the context of this curve, it does help you determine, are traps good enough for what I'm trying to accomplish, or do I need to go further? And if the answer is that they're good enough, then good job, you're done, do traps. But if the answer is no, I want to go further, we can start asking things like, well, how do we go further and what will that accomplish? So that's it for the surprise. Let me know how it goes if you run it. I'm always interested to hear about that, and I'm good. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye.